Oké, I think we can start. Ik denk dat we kunnen beginnen. Welcome at V2 in the studio of V2. I have to say feels slightly uncomfortable. I'm used to talking to a space that's filled with people, also more or less from this spot. And now I'm talking towards a camera, and I know that on the other side there's at least 50 people now watching me, and I can see you. That's a pity, but welcome at evening of the V2 archive, the online edition. We had of course hoped to have a proper evening of the V2 archive at our V2 ground floor, where we are here, and with Richard Bierhuizen and Menold, who are doing the technique, and with two of the three guests present in the studio, Lena Von Tagen and Katazini Jankowska. And our third guest is Alexandra Barankova, who is present in the chat. And I'll introduce all three of them later on. My name is Ari Altena. I am V2's archivist and website editor. I've been working at V2 since 2007. Is that correct? Yes, 2007. And have been diving into the archive of V2 since then, but I have been following V2 basically, if I'm exaggerating, since the early 1980s, but at least in the early 1980s I must have come across the name V2 for the first time as a venue where certain bands that I was interested in were performing. So tonight at the evening of the V2 archive, we also celebrate the 40 years of V2, or better, it's one part of our 40 years anniversary celebration. Another part was already last year, because V2 officially started in September 1981. Have to have the arithmetic right here. September 1981 in Den Bosch in the Netherlands, as basically as an artist initiative, and also as a place where exhibitions were organized, where bands came to play, performances were done, video evenings were held, and where also artists were tinkering with technology and making art with technology. I will not explain this whole history of V2 now. Of course, we just have like a small 2 hours to dive into certain aspects of the V2 archive and the history of V2 and 40 years of experiments in art, electronic art, technology, and reflection on society. So originally we'd hoped to have this as an evening at V2, and originally we also had hoped to have kind of, not an exhibition, but at least kind of props from the archive, because the V2 archive in the first place is a digital archive. So when I'm talking about the V2 archive, what I'm mostly thinking of is the website that we have and the archive part of that, but actually all of it is the archive part of it. But you will find the button archive there that you can click, and then you get in the proper archive part. And that has documentation of 40 years of events at V2. But of course, there's more stuff here, and we'd hoped to make a tiny kind of exposition for one day of stuff that you can find in the cupboards here as well, be it videotapes or just stuff remaining from an artist in residency project from 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Maybe this Super 8 16mm film that's in the cupboard here of Joris Ivens De Brug, as a remains of an art project from somewhere in the 1980s, that kind of stuff. But you have to kind of imagine that that's here as well. So for those of you who are not familiar with V2, V2 in Rotterdam presents, produces, archives and publishes research at the interface of art, technology and society. It was founded in '81, and in fact throughout the 40 years V2 has always looked at this the interplay between the world of art, the world of technology and the society at large, and has also stimulated, let's say, a critical reflection on electronic art, on how technology is changing the arts, but also how technology is changing the society. And the V2 archive is basically a result of documentation of all those events and stuff that has been organized first in Den Bosch and since 1994 in Rotterdam. So today, with our guest speakers Lena Von Tagen, Alexandra Barankova and Katazini Jankowska, we'd like to kind of look at how this history of 40 years, and also specifically look how younger researchers look at this history. So when we decided to do an evening of the V2 archive, what I thought would be interesting to do is not ask people that are as old as me and who've kind of maybe lived or have witnessed part of this history, but and not people who are maybe 30 years older and who have witnessed more of this history, but for this evening look at how younger researchers how they look at our archive, at this history of art and technology, their anecdotes, their fascinations, maybe what they took out of there. Because in the end, that's what an archive is for as well, I think, to inspire in the now, to inspire in the future as well. And so both Lena Von Tagen and Katazini Jankowska have been coming to V2 either in person or in virtually by contacting me through email, because they wrote their MA theses partly or completely on the V2 archive. So I thought this was a good opportunity to finally invite them for a contribution at V2. So one last thing as an introduction to mention is that we've made a little book on 40 years of V2. The printer promised us that it would be definitely here before the 20th, but I haven't seen the boxes, alas. But the cover is, well, maybe I'll show the cover later. Anyway, it's a little booklet with which highlights 12 works. It has an essay by me, kind of looking at 40 years of V2, and it will be freely available very, very soon. And what I'll do later on today, tonight, it partly builds on what I wrote in there. So at the end of our program, there will be discussion, or we'll have a round table, and that's also for you online audience an opportunity to send your questions or remarks to the chat. Of course, you can already send them to the chat now. And we have Rosa of V2, Rosa Zangenberg, who keeps an eye on the chat and who will relay remarks and or questions to me in order to discuss what goes on in your minds or answer your questions. Okay, I think I've talked enough for this part. I would like to introduce our first guest. That's Alexandra Barankova. So she's not here in person, and she pre-recorded her presentation. And this is also a moment when, and this is, I almost forgot it to mention, that this evening is also organized thanks to the NADD, the Netwerk Archieven Design en Digitale Cultuur, that Alexandra will also shortly say something about that. So Alexandra Barankova is an artist and researcher. She has a background in politics, heritage and memory studies and digital culture. And she has a fascination also in the ways in which digital media change the way we make sense of our realities. So she's been part of projects that deal with algorithmic imaginaries, embodiment in video games, and contemporary perceptions in time. And she works in text installations, code-based art, and games. She also works for the NNDD, the Netwerk Archieven Design en Digitale Cultuur, a network that aims to demonstrate that archiving and development of design and digital culture heritage is of vital importance in contemporary society. So let's listen to Alexandra's Barankova's presentation now.
Hello, and thank you to the whole V2 team for putting this evening together, and I'm assuming thank you to Ari for handing the word over to me. It's a shame that I can't join you and the other speakers directly at V2 tonight, but I'm unfortunately stuck in home quarantine. So I'm glad we could at least make do this way. My name is Alexandra Baranseva. I'm an artist and writer, and next to my own practice that moves in and around new media, I work as a producer and project assistant for the Network of Archives for Design and Digital Culture. And I'm here this evening to give a brief introduction to this network. So this platform, you could say, consists of heritage organizations, knowledge and research organizations, media labs, individual archives, all working across the fields of design and digital culture. So we have a very broad range of very different partners, among which is also V2 with its unique web-focused archives, but also other organizations, for example, like Sunday Morning at EKVC, which is a ceramics center that has a very different kind of material to deal with. At the moment, the network consists of over 40 partners. You can see some of the names here. And together in, well, it's a network formation, these partners aim towards a sustainable and accessible approach to archiving, design, and digital culture heritage in the Dutch context. So we see that archives and heritage more generally in these domains are spread out. They can take on hybrid forms or evade existing standards, and as a result pose new challenges when it comes to their preservation and archiving. So think of common examples of elements or items that are difficult to archive, such as video games, virtual worlds, social media, but I'm sure V2 also has many quite unique things in their own archives, like some obscure sound art performances and things like that, which all are quite unusual, to say the least, when it comes to finding useful ways to archive them. So the difficulty aside, we find that this material or cultural heritage in the domain of design and digital culture is often formative or crucially formative of our worlds, and that's at least speaking from a Dutch context. So in pushing the agenda for archiving this kind of material, the network also wants to highlight the importance of these domains for contemporary society. So in that, we stand by the statement that design and digital culture is all around us. And often things that might have started as obscure, sometimes artistic experiments are now parts of many people's daily lived realities. So you can read more about the network online through our website, or maybe even sign up for our newsletter. We'll make sure that links to these are circulated in the chat. And I guess I just want to say that one of the approaches that we use to achieve or to work towards an accessible archiving practice in these domains is through sharing knowledge or developing new knowledge through sessions like these. So today, this evening, I just wanted to share maybe an additional comment or small contribution from my end as to why this is a relevant task. So I'd say that one of the reasons that archiving these domains is so important is because things or kind of massive objects, concepts like technology can be surprisingly difficult to get a critical understanding of in retrospect without access to the nuances and complexities of how, for example, a particular technology might have come about. And I came across a useful formulation of this that I wanted to share in this book edited by Annette Decker, where Femke Snelting very eloquently describes the double play of de-emphasizing the impact of technological development with statements about how nothing has actually changed, while at the same time products of technological innovation are celebrated as novel and beyond comparison and therefore beyond critique. So we see here that, you know, on the one hand you can say, we've always done things the same way, you know, we've always read newspapers and now the smartphone is just a new thing. Or on the other hand you could say a new technology is completely new and revolutionary, therefore incomparable. So I think this statement to me just very well tightly kind of knitted together of how there are different sides of kind of not allowing you to make a comment on anything that is new to a particular technology. And I think it's because of this, or exactly because of this, to counter this, that we need to maintain the complexity and nuance of past and documentation of technologies. So I think there's a lot to be said here for the relevance of the 40 years of unstable media records at V2 that allow us to document the way things have unfolded over time and maintain a detail in that. So to wrap up, I guess I wanted to share a more particular example of something that I came across when wandering through V2's archive in preparation for this evening. I thought, what better way to do that than to just dive in. So one of the things that I stumbled across was a conference that was held at V2 in 1995. It was an event called Interfacing Realities, organized as a part of a conference on architecture and interfaces, which included contributions from many influential figures like Manuel de Landa or Greg Delin. But this in particular, I thought, just reading the text, and there was a lot in there, as not only the conference theme but also abstracts of the individual contributions. But I thought it was particularly useful to understand some aspects of interfaces that have actually become realities in our lives today. So just to mention a few excerpts, in the conference theme text they state, for example, that we see the creation of new information spaces which have structures distinctly different from those of the landscape or the city, but which still refer to the latter and are influenced by them. So I think this very nicely points to some of the metaphors that people were talking about at the time and still continue to. And here another question that they pose was, is there a necessity to develop an architecture which behaves as a dynamic system within which the inhabitants, environment, and architecture interact and whose functions are continually constituted and reconstituted by the interaction between the system and the user. So this is a question that is, equally pertinent perhaps today, and I think to me some of the excerpts in this text read kind of like an exploration of the limits of the available vocabulary at the time, which, speaking from the setting of kind of the streamed online hybrid Zoom event, also describe realities of some of the interfaces that we find ourselves using on a daily basis. So I wanted to conclude with that as my own kind of contribution of a small gem that I was very happy to stumble upon or across in the archive of V2. And with that, I'd like to hand the word over to, I guess, archive stories to come of the next speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra, for this very nice contribution for tonight. And yeah, actually very nice to read the quotation by Femke Snelting there. I always admired her work throughout the years, and she's done great stuff from Brussels these past couple of years. And also a nice gem from the archive there, and that kind of made me think about what gems did I find in the archive, in my own V2 archive, of course, of which I also do not know everything. At some point I found a full video of a lecture by Red Whittaker, a professor from Carnegie Mellon, from 1996, and this was about autonomous robots, self-driving cars. And to my surprise, all of the questions that play an important role in contemporary discussion, or the discussion in the past few years about self-driving cars, were already there. And also all the self-driving cars were already there, only they were riding on the moon and they were riding in mines and not out on the streets. So that was kind of nice gem to find while just on an evening kind of browsing through the V2 archive just for fun. Of course, yeah, let's go over to my proper presentation, though I'm not sure that my proper presentation differs so much from just talking about the archive, but I have some stuff here in front of me in text that I can read from or quote from. So maybe first of all the V2 archive online, which is one part of what we have. We have more. We have videotapes in cupboards that are not digitized yet, or maybe will never be digitized. We have A3 format year reports that I haven't put under a scanner yet. There is one of my little project that I hope to do at some point is scanning some of the postcard collection of Alex Adriaansens, who died a couple of years ago, like together with Joke Brouwer, the founder of V2. So these are postcards partly from the early 80s with just by friends, but with descriptions, for instance, of concerts people went to. So it gives an idea of the cultural context also of that time. So this is more in terms of what is there that I still would like to do. I also know what other people would still like to do with the archive. So I know that my colleague Stefan Hofland, the PR man of V2, would really like to make available all the early recordings that were put out on cassette in the 1980s and the early 1990s. Again, I don't know if that will be possible, but that's would be nice to do as well. It would be great to have a better look at the history of live streaming, all the live streaming that V2 did in the end of the 1990s. And I think it's some of that is really badly documented. So this is from before we had Zoom and Jitsi, and the live stream was probably done in a resolution that you would like laugh very hard about right now. But it's from the time when people were raving, or when there was a lot of enthusiasm, for instance, for things like the Palace. Anybody remember the Palace? Or for Moose, so the multi-user dungeons, object-oriented, Lambda Mo and the Metro of the digital city in Amsterdam. Like all this stuff from a long time ago that sometimes people only remember still, and that is hardly documented, that even if you do some hard Googling or DuckDuckGoing, is difficult to find. So that also kind of makes it clear, in a sense, why it's useful to have this documentation online and accessible and in a place where a lot of people can get to it. Because it's these documents on the basis of which we can write and rewrite our art histories or our histories on the interaction of art, technology, and society. And I think we make new art histories all the time. We construct history anew and anew and anew, always again on the basis of our interest in the now or interest in a certain future. So there is not just one art history, there is lots of art histories and there are future art histories, but we can only tell those histories when we have documents, and when there are new documents, or when there are when there is the idea that certain documents are missing, and you can construct this missing of the documents from other information. It's only in those times, it's only when that's there that we can construct new stories and new art histories that shed light on the past, and with that light we can understand our now and we can understand our future better. And especially this is of course the this is the case in this world of technology, which has been marred in a sense by an ideology of innovation, or a discourse of innovation where it's kind of sometimes forgotten that certain things have been existing for quite a while already. The whole discourse about VR is a very good example of this. If you dive into the history of VR, then you find that the discussions about VR from 1993, for instance, are very, very much similar to the discussions now, or the discussions of 5 years ago. Though some things are also different. And it's maybe this feeling of kind of certain estrangement, or this feeling of strangeness of stuff from the past that is just like the present, but still a bit different, that I think is very productive, or could be very productive, or sometimes is very productive. At least it's something that fascinates me, and it's something that makes this diving into the archive something that is very worthwhile. So not one history, but a lot of histories. And I think of the V2 archive as maybe a repository, not the right word, but as this big database, this big mess maybe even, from which you can construct, make, tell stories. So our website contains descriptions of more than 1,300 events that were organized by V2 over 40 years, along with about 600 longer texts, so that would be essays or transcriptions of lectures. Of course, this is before the time when we had transcription software that just transcribes any lecture that's been given. Descriptions of almost 1,000 works of art and projects exhibited at V2, 1,600 biographies of artists and speakers, etc. and then links to hundreds of videos ranging from full recordings of events to brief interviews with artists, and then hundreds of scanned program booklets, article PDFs, and thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs. And the archives continues to grow daily with, of course, each new event that we do and documentation that we add to it, but also with older stuff that until now has not been added yet, and that I sometimes, if I have time, add to old events or older works of art. So I think that no unequivocal picture from the history of art and technology can emerge from an archive like this one. It's diverse, and if you try to make it into one story, you quickly find that there's all kinds of things that will contradict your story, and of course you can then find other things that do not contradict the stories to tell your story in the right way. But I think it's great that it has this possibility of many stories to tell, and it's therefore also, I think, important that different people make use of all this information. So I think an archive is brought to life through use, and it possesses the potential for history to be written. So in that sense, I would say, and without getting into a philosophical discussion here, that an archive is not yet the history, and it is not per se representation of history. Of course, I'm on a bit problematic ground here, but in a practical way, I would say, like, we have documentation here. That's the archive. The archive has documentation, and this documentation makes it possible to make art history, and it possesses the potential for that. Of course, what is not in the archive will probably not be told unless you construct its absence, and from that construction of the absence you can tell also stories, or construct histories. So that's very interesting as well, or sometimes very important to do. But as an archivist, I'm also kind of, when I'm browsing through the archive myself or looking at it, I'm being struck by the fact that it is not always clear if something that you find, of which you find the documents, if that was something that was considered very important at that moment, that was kind of something that was central to maybe not the world of art or the world of technology, but at least to this niche world that V2 is part of, kind of an experimentation with new technologies and making art with that. Or if that was really kind of a side project that did happen, but not many people were interested in, not many people came. Maybe it was a side project, and you cannot always immediately see that. Of course, if something was part of the Dutch Electronic Art Festival, you can assume that there was kind of a curatorial thinking behind it. But there is so much more also in the archive, and that kind of brings also a certain wonderment. And I'm also thinking about how we do our archiving now, and we keep sometimes so much of every event that if I imagine a future other person that will find those computer folders on the server or on an old computer or wherever, and then find 200 photos and a lot of other stuff, and then try to kind of construct, like, what was this? How important was this? What role was this playing? So yeah. I also know that some stuff simply gets stored and simply keeps on being on the server, on our archive server, simply because nobody ever took the effort to throw it away. And of course, the older it is, the less you will be willing to throw it away. I also know that throughout the years, and these are the stories, of course, you do not want to tell, that some things have been accidentally deleted. And I know, some of the archives of mailing lists, for instance, that were very important for the history of net art, for instance, have been accidentally erased. And I know Andreas Broekman knows a lot about that, and I've spent at some different points in time like hours and hours trying to re-find it, but no. This was about the syndicate mailing list. That's like the archive story that you don't want to tell, stuff that's been accidentally erased for whatever reason. Should I have been telling that? Maybe not. So without interpretation, I think an archive is nothing more than a loosely ordered database, and that could have been ordered in some other way as well. And it's this interpretation that I'm interested in. And of course, every archive has its bias, and the chief bias of our archive is, of course, that it only or almost only contains information about projects organized by V2 or at V2, including the Dutch Electronic Art Festival, which ran from 1994 till 2014. And some events are extremely well documented, and some that may have been more important have been less well documented for whatever reason. Sometimes it has simply been lack of money. But I still think, and I think this is the basis of our archive, that it makes accessible the most important information about what stuff that happened at V2 that's of interest for artists, students, researchers as well, and also if you're just interested in this history of art and technology, electronic art. So we're also looking into ways to activate the archive. The book that we made is one. So the book 40 Years of V2, the events that we do are one, but it's also used in education or informal education, and one particular project or projects are the reenactments. For instance, earlier or last year, the famous work in Tona by Dick Rijmakers was reenacted, or actually kind of reinterpreted by the D&K ensemble. And Marnix de Nijs, the Rotterdam-based artist that did a lot of stuff at V2, is currently researching the transnational activation of simultaneous touch. Later this year there will be an event around that year. So it is about sending tactile information through the internet. And he looks, for instance, into Norman White and Doug Beck's telephonic arm wrestling, and also doing some art historical research on the site. And he will kind of also make a new kind of prototype, probably. Nevertheless, looking at the time, for the book, 40 Years of V2, I did try to kind of construct or tell one story. Kind of, I must say I had real problems. I found it really difficult to write a piece of text about 40 years of V2, because 40 years is pretty long. And also, if you look back to the early 80s, this was such a different time from now. And then definitely if you look at how our relationship to technology, and also our ideas about technology and our dreams about technology. So though you can tell many stories by zooming in to different themes in this world, I decided to zoom in to, let's say, one of the largest questions. And I looked at kind of the development of how artists in this field of experimentation in art and technology have approached technology. And one thing maybe stayed the same, and that is simply a fascination with what you can do with technology, whatever sort of technology, if this is low-tech or really, really high-tech. And it's a fascination about also what it does to you as a human being, and what it does to the world, and how it changes the world, or how you remake a society in a certain way. But then if I look back to, let's say, the early 1990s, the middle 1990s, and I remember a certain enthusiasm and really, a critical enthusiasm, definitely, about a lot of newer technologies that, of course, were built sometimes already existing for a while, that were not yet, let's say, implemented in our world. They had not changed our world in any deep way. They maybe existed already for a couple of years, but they had the promise to thoroughly remake our society, or remake economy, or remake our arts. There was definitely an enthusiasm around that, and it's also true. I think there were new technologies, and you can mention them all, from the internet to nanotechnology to genetic manipulation. They had not been implemented in society. And if you look at the world now, our world has been changed by those very same technologies. Maybe not all, but a lot of them. And I would actually say that at this moment there is no enthusiasm about new technologies. It's rather that I now mean as artists, I'm not an artist, but let's say we are stuck in with a lot of technologies that are very difficult to break free from, maybe, though we might sometimes want to. So from a critical enthusiasm, it morphs into, or it has changed into maybe an approach that starts with more social issues, and also with the question how we can change those, and how we can change those maybe by, again, changing our technologies, not by using new technologies, but by changing the way we are using all the technologies that we now have. Of course, another thing that is really different now from those early 90s is that it has finally become clear to many of us and to the world that our way of dealing with the world has been quite harmful, or is quite harmful, and that we have to fundamentally change our ways of dealing with ourselves and the earth, and also how we think about this relationship. So global warming, climate change, the new climate regime, all of that. I don't know if I have to kind of lay that whole story out for you. So I think that's a very important change in that sense. If you would look at those 40 years. So I will stop here. You can read this in a slightly more precise way in the essay that's part of the book 40 Years V2 that will be hopefully delivered on the doorstep at V2 tomorrow, and otherwise next week. And that's probably also going to be published online. That's it for me for the moment. Thank you. Normally some people would be kind of like, maybe not applaud, but say something now. I have to kind of now change myself from presentation mode to moderator mode, and go, yeah, that was a good one. a slight technical glitch, at least here in the studio, which makes it possible for me to make the transformation. Let's go to our second guest of tonight. I'm very happy that she's here. Lena Von Tagen. Now I want to have the bio correct. And Lena Von Tagen, as I said, she wrote her MA thesis a couple of years ago on the V2 archive, and also visited then. And her work is regularly published in the Dutch contemporary art magazine Metropolis M. In 2006, she completed her degree at Fine Art at St. Joost, and then started a master's degree in comparative arts and media studies at the VU in Amsterdam. And her areas, she's a writer, and her areas of interest are artist archives, art is historiography, and art and historiography. And she's currently also working on her own research into art historical and political implications of spatial interventions in a monumental location in Croatia, if that's for people who are been familiar with the field of V2 and media art. She is indeed the daughter of Lena Von Tagen, and this also means she has inherited some sort of a fascination for archiving. So Lena, it's floor is yours.
So thank you, Ari, for that introduction. And so now for something completely different. Before I start reading the story I prepared for tonight, I want to return to what Ari just said about storing files on computers and how we arrange that. Not only archivists, but also creative individuals are maybe familiar with a hard drive that is full of files and sub-files that are organized in an order that only the user of that particular computer is able to get around in. So while I'm speaking, I would like you to keep in mind those full hard disks, because I think they're important for the story I'm going to tell. So what I want to speak about this evening is partly what I wrote my MA thesis on, that Ari already referred to, but it's also part of a fascination I have had for a longer period of time with archiving, and especially archiving art. So I want to talk about digital archiving as an act of documentation, but also as an act of creation. In this talk, I'll refer to two specific examples: the V2 website archive, naturally, and my father's own attempt at digitally preserving his own artistic legacy. So, in my opinion, these two archives both face a dilemma that digital preservation of art has to grapple with in a more general sense, namely observing a shift that might occur from archive to artwork, or even back and forth. Later on, I will speak in more general terms, but to be able to do so, I must start by telling a personal story. I must return to a rainy afternoon in early February of 2015, when I first set foot inside V2. So, with my father, the aforementioned artist and archivist Lena Von Tagen, I went to see his old acquaintance, Alex Adriaansens. The two had met in the early 1980s. While wandering through the south of the Netherlands, Cheb had followed a trail set out by a series of dingy-looking posters that led him to a squatted building in the Vugterstraat, number 234 in Den Bosch. Not much later, this location would come to be known as V2. Here my father collected posters and pamphlets produced by the Artist Initiative to announce their events. What he procured then for the Documentation Center for Social Movements of the University of Amsterdam is today stored inside the Institute of Social History, also in Amsterdam. During our visit in 2015, the two men keenly invoked the early days of V2. As a souvenir, Adriaansens gifted my father the Dick Rijmakers monograph the lab published in 2007. In 1990, Chebe stopped working as an archivist at the university library. However, he never stopped collecting, both in the material world and the digital one he has been building concurrently. Today, he's working on another documentation center, be it not under a heading of a university, but under his own name. The foundation he is setting up is called the Archive Committee of the Future and is meant to deal with his own artistic legacy and the estates of his creative contemporaries. One day, this archive will become digitally accessible to the public. The monograph with which we left V2 that afternoon is part of this collection, and as such it will live on even when the paper book becomes a thing of the past. So now fast forward to 2018. In this year I returned to V2 to do research into its digital archive as part of my master thesis at the VU in Amsterdam. The resulting text was titled The Fluidity of Fact and Fiction, the V2 website archive as unstable medium and artwork. So that sounds vague and big, and it was in some way. My initial research question with which I started was, is the V2 digital archive an unstable medium? So in order to answer that, I went into the archive and I came across its original manifesto for the unstable media. So first I concluded that the archive is in fact a medium because it functions as a conduit. It transfers the information it stores to the people that use it. And it is unstable because as is written in the manifesto for the unstable media, it is a medium that makes use of electronic waves and frequencies such as engines, sound, light, video, computers, and so on. So basically it is something that is pretty hard to pin down and preserve in itself. Next, I wondered if the V2 archive could also be considered a work of art in its own right. In this context, I defined the term artwork rather elusively as the production of a previously non-existent form that is new because it creatively restructures works that came before it. So, to answer this question, I resorted to Jacques Derrida's archival theory, archive fever. In this text, Derrida writes that the archive is a pliable tool used for the shaping of the future, rather than a sealed container made for holding the past. A space in which remembering is just as important as forgetting and imagining, where the so-called death drive, a need to destroy, is as pressing as archive fever, an all-encompassing need to collect. In addition, I borrowed the term ekphrasis, the act of capturing a visual artwork in words, from literary theory, and supplemented it with the word archival. I introduced this merger as archival ekphrasis, the description that enters into an archive in the absence of the artwork it details. In doing so, this text simultaneously keeps an artwork alive and tries to take its place. In case of the V2 archive, there are many such instances in which documentation turns into the creation of a new text or a new work of art. Therefore, I was able to answer my research question with a resounding yes. What I did not realize at the time is that by doing so, I turned the archive into the opposite of its original function, a monolith. Since then, my opinion has changed. I no longer focus on what we should remember, but on what we can forget. Not only in respect to what is stored inside a given archive, but also to collections in their entirety. Archives need to be used. For the most part, archivists don't use archives, but fill them. If the knowledge they guard remains untouched, it loses its value, and the archive, deprived of its function, becomes an artifact. An archive that is in use remains in motion. It never stands still. It is an unstable medium, or so I argued. In the context of this evening, Ari writes, an archive comes to life by using it. The archive does not yet represent history. It has the potential to write history. So, archivists gather and describe. Users pull these collections apart again in order to be able to absorb the information they need. In 2015, I saw how an artist initiative that started in a squat in Den Bosch had grown into an internationally renowned lab for the unstable media in the center of Rotterdam. In 2018, I declared describing and recording this development a deed of creation. Today, in 2022, I have to restructure some of my former statements. Unlike my father's committee, which for this moment consists of a database on one person's computer and the bookshelves of a few other people, V2's digital archive has been available through its website since the 1990s. It did not arise in isolation, as most collections do, but in dialogue. I realize now there is no clear-cut answer to the question of whether V2's digital archive is indeed an artwork in its own right. An archive is not necessarily a work of art if additions to existing works are made within it, but if there are no users to consult either the original work or its stand-in. Archives of creative individuals often only have a creator and no users for a longer period of time. That is why they could be considered artworks more readily than archives of art institutions, which are more widely accessible. On the other hand, as an institution, V2 has also expressed a clear identity over the years in the events it organizes and subsequently in how these events are archived. So, are archives works of art? Some are, but is the digital archive of V2 an artwork? Maybe not, as long as we can use it, and rightfully so. In 2003, my father was a speaker at the Dutch Electronic Art Festival that took place here at V2. The theme of the festival was From Wunderkamer to Metadata. Here he presented his Ars Memoria system, the predecessor of the Archive Committee of the Future. I wish to quote what he said then, nearly 10 years ago. My experience as an archivist, librarian and artist has led me to make my personal model for discovering, finding and organizing that what makes sense to me in the world of information. Its sole purpose is to have it as a tool to make my own project something that has no finished stage, a boat that is structured and rebuilt while sailing the seas of information. So, why am I standing here tonight and not my father, the seasoned artist and archivist? Because I am an outsider. I'm the potential user of both the V2 archive and the database my father is building. In both instances, I ask myself, can I navigate these archives without an archivist to guide me? If the answer is yes, I'm looking at an archive. If the answer is no, it could very well be that it is in fact an artwork. The usability of an archive, especially one of the digital kind, can change, and these categories can shift. I did not come here tonight to place judgment. Building an archive and an artwork that mimics an archive are both noble pursuits, but the two should not be confused. My goal is for art institutions and creative individuals who are watching this and might be putting their own records in order to ask themselves, what am I building and for whom? All answers are allowed. You just reply honestly and you might be surprised with what you find. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lena, for also a very eloquent description of a difference between an artwork and an archive, that seen from the perspective of usability. Let's go on to our third guest of tonight, Katazini Jankowska, from Lithuania originally. She's a writer, editor and researcher who's currently based in Rotterdam. She holds a BA in Art History and Theory from Vilnius Arts Academy and an MA from in Arts, Culture and Society from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Her interests include critical post-humanism with a specific focus on artistic research and new media art and digital technologies and world-building practices. And her writings and reviews have been published in Lithuanian and international art magazines. So, Katazina, please.
Thank you for the introduction. And as Ari already said, I used V2 Archive for my master thesis. And tonight I want to share some of my stories that I made from the archive and share some gems that I took from it. So in my research, I was arguing for the potential of art to social change. And I was looking for ways in which works of at the intersection of art and technology engage with the critiques of traditional Western human-centered ideologies and create new social imagination which includes both human and non-human perspectives. Although it is still not a common approach to use physical or digital archives for conducting a social research and use it as a corpus of sociological proof, because social science presence within the archival turn was relatively muted until recently. But my aim was to exhaustively analyze the large body of artworks that are contained in the archive and present the recurrent patterns of ways in which artists can challenge prevalent anthropocentric thinking and identify a body of actions that art does in terms of shaping our collective imagination about possible forms of human relations to non-human world. And although some of the artworks in the archive engage with these themes directly, most of the artworks are not explicitly linked with the themes of the post-human or directly address the goal of changing social relations between humans and non-humans. But the intrinsic unstable nature of the archive allows those documents to be read from the current perspective And as we are slowly moving, or at least aiming to move towards more post-human reality, the archive seemed to me as a fruitful area to look for the underlying and overlooked abilities of technology-based art in critiques towards Western philosophy of humanism, which is deeply rooted in Cartesian binary systems and criticizing the exceptionalism of a human and the hierarchical relation to the world. So in my research, I developed my own sampling scheme, which I applied for all the artworks that are contained in the archive, which is more than 1,000. And then I selected 100 of different works that spanning from early 90s until the present day, that in one way or another go beyond the human. And during my study, I realized that distinctive features of unstable media are actually crucial to communicating the idea of post-human, and specifically the use of innovative technologies that allow us to go beyond the human perception and to collect data beyond what human sensory organs can collect. The interactive approach, which allows for the interplay between human, machine, and animal, and experiential and sensorial qualities that provide a unique experience to perceive different aspects of social realities. So let me present some of the most illustrative examples of my findings. Out of the 100 works I analyzed, the majority of artistic projects do not focus exclusively on the human, but position us in a relation to other living beings that we share our world with. And what is also important, that they show more than representational approach. That means they recognize other forms of intelligence and their creative potential, this way rejecting the exceptionalism of the human, and also rather than focusing on pets or companion animals, these artworks brought to the fore the multiplicity of animal life that previously were left on margins of the art world and humanist ideology in general. So here you see the work by Emmy Youngs called A Holodeck for House Crickets. And in this work, we're able to see the world from the cricket's point of view. These insects were initially bred in a climate control laboratory as a food for the reptiles, and they were never able to see their natural environment. So here, simulating the artificial natural environment, this installation provides crickets the ability to interact with each other, and by chirping, they are able to change the perspective seen on the installation. So each chirp advances the panoramic cricket eye view footage on the installation. Another example is a work by Ken Ronaldo called Delicate Balance, in which the motor sensors on a fishbowl can detect Siamese fighting fish, and move the bowl in the direction that fish is looking at the outside world. So it basically shows how intelligent systems can show us more than we can see with our bare eyes, and how we can adopt a non-human perspective. And there were plenty of examples in which artists used technologies to show more than representational approaches and engage with realities of others, such as animals, insects, and fish, allowing to access the realms that are otherwise hidden from the human side, and represent the characteristics and agency of animals and nature that otherwise remain invisible, inaudible, and imperceptible to us. Another work I want to share is an interactive installation which determines human-made underwater noise pollution and turns it into the three-dimensional sound field, which in turn creates an embodied feeling of the noise pollution that marine animals experience every day. So by using innovative technologies, the work opens a window into the underwater world and allows one to experience otherwise inaccessible aspects of our environment, but also from the perspective of marine species. Another work I would like to mention is Woodworms' microphone and sound system, in which the sound of woodworms eating their way out of the wood is picked up and intensified with a microphone. So here the sound of a small life form, too small to be heard by humans, by means of technology is brought into perception. And this acousmatic experience, that means hearing sounds without the identifiable source, becomes a tool to comprehend what is happening in and to our environment. Going further with the sound dimension, the work of Matthew Munich, Microscopic Opera, presents C. elegans, the microscopic view of lab worms is translated on big screens, but the movement of lab worms, which is influenced by changing vibrations and temperature under the microscope, the movement is translated into synthetic sound, and in artists' own words, makes lab worms composers performing an abstract opera piece together. So it is, of course, quite ironic reference to the considered highest art form of human culture. But in this and previously mentioned works as well, non-human animals can be recognized as also as creators of the artwork, because both non-human animals, technology, and the artists are responsible for the outcome of the artwork. So the work is created in the conjunction, which makes these works nothing less than post-human. Another theme that appeared often in the archive was the recognition of agency of plants and creation of plant-machine hybrids. This is the work by Natalie Hebert, where she creates the symbiosis between living plant and electronic interface. So the unique shrinking reaction to touch of this plant is used in the work to read and mediate the signal, which starts to pump the water into the next pot. Another example is an action plan by Ivan Henriks. Central to this piece is a sensitive plant enhanced with a motor system, a signal amplifier on a customized board of a wheelchair detects the plant's internal signals, and when it's being touched, it enables the plant to drive away. So by interacting with these biomachines, we become aware of existence of electrical signals circulating inside the plant, and it can potentially change our perception on plants that are considered as inanimate objects. And the assemblage of organic plant and technological device can create this new hybrid structure that implodes boundaries between technological and organic. Although all the works in the V2 archive have technological aspects by definition, certain projects seem to help us unpack common assumptions about human relation to machines by creating direct physical encounters with technologies that result in different sensorial experiences. So for instance, here is a work called The Blind Robot, a work that creates an intimate encounter with a robotic arm that mimics the movement of a blind person and touches the face of a visitor sitting in front of it, and this way, with its fingertips, learns human features. And the physical experience and the setting is crucial here, because letting a robot to touch your face in an art space, knowing that it's learning human feature, would definitely differ from a robot performing tasks in a medical space. And of course, it also has a potential to change our perception of robots that is grounded in these dystopian, utopian narratives. And another sensorial experience that often occurred in the archive was the creation of new kind of embodiments, which is enhancing human physical body with technological device. And these can be seen as a concrete expressions of cyborg configurations. But again, they are distant from cyborg fantasies seen in science fiction movies, because these artistic realizations can be adapted to real-life situations. So this is a great example of a work where visitors can have a temporary experience and to wear a prosthetic that allows them to feel electrical stimulation patterns on the tongue. So while feeling these patterns, the brain recognizes them as information of artists' physiological or emotional changes. So that is to say that using this device connected to the tongue, we can not only feel different senses, but also acquire new skills to learn human emotions. And of course, on a more theoretical level, it disrupts the dualistic oppositions of human and machine. So all these works are examples of certain pattern of thought seen in new media art that in one way or another go beyond the human. And by studying a large amount of data that is available in the archive, I was able to trace the development of seemingly recent ideas of the post-human and overlooked ways in which media art can provide a critical insight into common social beliefs and reshape our social values, specifically those that relate to human relation to non-human others. And certain patterns in the archive, such as recognition of other than human agency, adoption of non-human perspective, repositioning human by including the other animal or technological entities, and engaging with environmental themes, show artistic contribution to broader social cultural processes that are happening right now. But as I mentioned before, art archives and artistic projects are still largely overlooked in academia, and I'm talking from the social science perspective, because it tends to ignore different forms of knowledge that exist outside university. And this is, I believe, where the importance of this kind of archive comes to place, because this specific kind of knowledge, non-discursive, tacit, sensual, embodied in these kind of artworks, still exist in places that are made for artists, art institutions, or galleries. And I believe that the archive not only allows to see the development of certain thought in arts, but also it can be approached as a site where scholars like me and others can look for what artists are researching and make use of often neglected artistic research, and rethink also the outdated rules in academia and I suggest that this awareness of new users of archives can be of a vital support to reduce this kind of tension between artistic research and academia. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Katazina. I propose now that we sit here, and I'm trying to keep some sort of a 1.5 meter distance from each other, and open up sort of a discussion round table, and also, of course, open up the discussion to our online audience. So to our online audience, you can put your questions or remarks in the chat, and I do have a screen in front of me, and I do see the chat as well, but in case I am sidetracked or have my attention to what the guests are saying, there is also a moderator for the chat, Rosa Zangenberg, who will make sure that questions come through. But let's start here. Both of you, thanks for the presentations, very different in a sense, and I don't think I will make an effort to kind of connect them together. But I'm very happy also with the kind of the two different views on archive. You really have dived into the archive also with a sort of art historical view, and in that sense have done exactly what I as an archivist hope that people will do. And then you, Lena, you have also in a different way made very clear what the importance of having an archive is, and also in a sense looking at this difference between the archives of artists and then an archive where there is someone who takes an effort to order and structure things in a certain way. So there's, let's just start with one question to you, Katazina. What I find very interesting is that you delve up a couple of works from the archive that that I didn't know very well. For instance, the Ken Rinaldo one was, well, not new to me, but and also the Emmy Youngs one, for instance. I was wondering if you saw a difference in time between works, for instance, that were made last year or maybe 2 years ago, and more issues that came up concerning these more ecological or the human, non-human relations that were looked at in maybe the middle 90s. I mean, the work of Ken Rinaldo is, I think, of 96. Did you see a difference there, or?
Yes, I think I noticed that works that were created recently were more engaged with all these environmental and ecological themes. But that's why I was not looking for works that explicitly stated that the aim of the work is really address this kind of issues. It was interesting to see that perhaps these works that I mentioned, especially those from earlier, the aim of the work wasn't to produce knowledge of some sort and to address this kind of issues, but it's nice how they still do that. And it's a matter of perspective how you perceive this work, and I think it's really important to see the power of art in really communicating certain ideas, but only from if you look it from the perspective of time, because maybe like 20 years ago, a work of Ken Rinaldo, I guess it was relevant, but not so explicitly stated back then. So I think this is the most interesting part of navigating the artwork and looking for what you can find there and how you can interpret these works.
Yeah. I was also, I mean, in working on this essay, at some point, I also kind of also inspired by your what you wrote. I looked into like keywords like ecology, and then you see really that around 1994 with a Dutch Electronic Art Festival that I think had the theme of digital nature. There were quite a number of works that looked at these issues, and some of it is really also connected to the thinking of ecology, of being of what we now call entanglement. But part of it was really looking at digital nature and growing digital art as a sort of nature. Did you look into that as well? Or?
Yeah, it was actually really interesting when I was preparing for this this talk. I was going through archive again, actually, and then there were some series of festivals that already were talking about all these things that I talked today, you know, and it was 15 years ago or so, and I was terrified that I won't tell anything new because people already talked about like 15 years ago or no. So it's also interesting to find that people were talking about all these things before, but it wasn't such a hyped, I think, you know, as it is right now. Such a prevalent theme that a lot of artists engage with right now.
There's one thing, I have to say it. I hear you say like 15 years ago, it's 25 years ago. And I heard you say do the same. You said, like, as my father said 10 years ago, but it was 20 years ago. Yeah. Almost 20 years ago. And there's apparently a trick that's being played with our minds, that some of these things are actually longer ago than we feel that they are. It happens to me as well, and maybe that's why I heard it. You both now do it, because I've made this same mistake so often, and but yeah, indeed, it's. Kind of to you, Lena, maybe one of another event that I find very interesting from the past of V2 is the manifestation for extreme information streams, extreme informatiestromen. Mm-hmm. And actually your father was part of that as well, or he was involved in it, and you sent me a couple of photos as well that I didn't know. This is also an event from the past that was looking at certain maybe themes that are very still very current, or have been very current now, like information overload, the amount of information. Still there's kind of quite a few things are very different as well if you look at that event. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or...
I think what I found interesting about that specific event is that it's very much, it is so different from what V2 is doing now, mm-hmm. Because it was not here in Rotterdam, it was in Den Bosch in an old factory. And the entire room was filled with these kind of plexiglass vitrines in which there were posters and pamphlets. And it was really, the paper era of V2. And I think it's also important, and maybe I find that important because that are the first stories that I've ever heard about V2, to look at how an institution that now focuses on new media also had a start with papers and pamphlets and booklets and things like that. So I think that's an interesting contrast, because there was a lot of talk about these unstable media, But on the other hand, the unstable media themselves were presented in a very conventional way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's also, and that's why I find this manifestation interesting, or also that moment, that you see that part of a discourse of lots of information, extreme information streams. We can now do it ourselves, because that was a big theme in '87, I think it was actually about cassette culture, and was about do-it-yourself zine making before actually all of us, all of our normal citizens, had an easy access to computer communication, to the internet. Though at the same time, this BBSs already existed, so that was kind of as a ghost in the back there as well. I find it interesting. I mean, one of the things that I hope always that an archive can do is kind of reconstruct those moments and reconstruct the different aspects of that moment, and also these ideas around zines, do it yourself, take hold of the media yourself, not as someone who's in power and who's doing the media, that were coming from zine making and cassette culture, and then informing or really coming to flourish on the early internet. And then if you look now, like there is already for quite a while under artists, a lot of artists that make zines again, like paper zines, and that do cassettes as well. Actually as a kind of counter force against doing things on the internet. I don't have a question on that. I'm just acting as the third person who's both moderating and asking questions. I'm just looking at the chat. Is there anyone from online there who has questions? Can be on a complete different subject from the history of 40 years, either to Lena or to Katazini or to me.
Got some in the Q&A, so they will not pop up with her, so I'll post them in the chat so you can read them.
Yeah, okay. I understand that there was some stuff going on in the Q&A which I don't see here, but it will be posted. I'll read the question. I have a question specifically for Lena. These distinctions between artworks and archives very much interest me. I'm curious about your perspective on Olia Lialina's and Dragan Esvensheet's 1 terabyte of kilobyte age that builds on the geocited dataset by reanimating it as, amongst others, a Tumblr archive, a research blog, and an installation. How do you see the boundaries between artwork and archive in this body of work, specifically as these artists become artists as archivists of the internet? So I'm not sure, do you know that work?
No,
or
I'm
that?
not familiar with it,
Okay.
no.
Yeah.
Makes it hard to answer.
Yeah. No, it's actually, I'm not really, I haven't looked very good into the work of Olia Lialina and Dragan Esvensheet, but I know what they're doing there. I I don't know if I have an answer to that really. It makes that story more complex. I would say it's in your definition, it would be an artwork, because in your definition of an archive, it looks at the usability. Is it ordered? Is it structured in a way that also a normal, whatever is a normal user, but someone who's interested in finding information can find it. But yeah, this is part of course, in another way, it's a very interesting thing that there is a lot of stuff off the internet that has been gone. Hives is a good example in the Netherlands. The Digitale Stad, the MOS that I was mentioning as well as a much older thing, is one too. Yeah, it's great work that these things are being stored and then put in a different environment again. But yeah, I also don't have a further answer to that. And then there's a question from Michelle to Katazina. You ended your talk on a strong note. Academia seems to overlook the V2 archive. I could not agree with you more. Could you elaborate on why this is the case and any suggestions how to overcome this? Yeah, that's a big one.
Well,
Not sure if this is Michelle van Dartel, the director of V2. Could be. Who's asking the question?
no, but I still think that in social science research, people tend to focus more on interviewing, field notes, and other methods of collecting data rather than searching and in archives, and especially digital archives, I think. And I believe that as artistic research that is stored there, they can contribute, like they can make use of that as well, not only archive, but the knowledge that is stored by artists. And I think that it's still overlooked in academia, the artistic research itself, although they tend to kind of make distinction easier, but I think there's still a difference between that. So I think we're going in that way, that people are using archives for the research, but there's still a gap. And but my point was that it's pretty interesting to use archive for the research and implement it in the academia. So I encourage to do that.
Yeah, but you also specifically, because you're talking about social sciences, about sociology, which is very much depending on these databases that are being collected, or databases of information collected by on basis of surveys, and which actually also kind of collect certain information and take out a whole range of other experiences or other ways of experiencing our social reality.
Was it a question?
Yeah, but if it's specifically also that sort of social science that you were targeting.
Yeah, the one that I have a personal experience in. So from my experience, people were not tending to use archives with already existing data, but to collect it themselves. So that, I think, is the reason for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. There's not more questions yet here. Maybe a question to Lena. Where would you like the V2 archive to develop more?
I think what I spoke about is usability of the archive. So the V2 archive, I think its strongest point is that it's accessible to a lot of people via the website, and it's a very small, it's very easy to visit it and to make use of it as a researcher. So accessibility is already there, but I think it should also, in order to be used more, it should be known more. And I think creating a network between different kinds of archives, as we saw at the beginning of this evening, is a very good way in order to make not only the V2 archive but also other archives more readily available and more known. So I think also that is not just in archiving, but in a more general sense, in the Dutch art world, we're such a small country and there's little interconnection in the field. And I think if that would be organized better, it would yield great results. Yeah.
And then it could also be used more, for instance, in education.
Yes. I think in all fields, not just academic research, but also artistic research, because when we all, both our talks mentioned that ideas come back again and again, not only in text, but also in artworks that are being reenacted or that inspire new artwork. So if archives are something that is placed more at the foreground, then this will happen more readily.
Yeah. I see a question from Marijn Bril to Katazina. How did you come to your selection of 100 works? What methods did you use?
Hi to Marijn.
Sorry?
Hi, I'm saying hi to Marijn.
Okay.
So after reading a large amount of literature, I developed my own sampling scheme. And there were certain points that I looked for in the artworks, such as focusing on non-human others, addressing the relationship between humans or non-human others in other than hierarchical way, and all the other kind of characteristics that I was looking in the works, and then it was not so difficult to actually find hundreds of artworks that did that from a lot more that you have in the archive actually.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's simply possible to do that, and let's see if there's more questions coming up here. So I would suggest that this is like slowly getting to last chances for questions from the audience. I see it's 9:45, which is nearing our end time anyway. Yes, hello from Bolzano. From someone who didn't know the V2 archive before. I'm sure our department, okay, it's not a question, it's kind of a thank you, so that's nice. General question, since the archive is now available on the website, what kind of future do you see for it? So that's probably mostly to me. But I think the future is also the now, in the sense that it is this database repository, website, archive, that people can use for their to pursue their whatever they are interested in, but for their research, for their studies, as an inspiration for new works, as an inspiration to kind of look critical at current technologies or at how we deal with our world. So I actually hope, in first place, that it becomes better known, but more even that also all the other archives, even if they are just behind the doors still, or in a cupboard, or on a server which is not accessible, from all these other organizations like V2. I mean, we have Mediamatic, Impact, we have Sonic Acts, many more in the Netherlands, and also in the world of design, because it's not only the world of new media, art and technology, and to also open up a view on this history of new media art and the world of art and technology, because I think we could know much more about that, and especially know much more about the history of it, so we are not reenacting every time again that something is so new, or that it's much easier for us as citizens to see that when someone tells us that something is so new, that it's actually not so new, and it's a rehash or a bad rehash of something, a dream from the past, for instance. So yes, that's what I hope for it, and simply to grow in that sense. I mean, I personally hope to put a lot of also old stuff online and make that accessible. I don't know if you have anything else to add there, or think that I'm saying something which doesn't make sense. Could also be. Let's see, a last question maybe. Okay, because I also want to kind of close off in a nice way and say thank you to Lena for your presentation, and thank you to Katazina for her presentation, and thank you all for being present virtually and follow it until here. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to say. I don't know if Alexandra is still in the chat, and wanted to announce a couple of other archive-related events in the near future that have also a connection to the NADD, the Network for Archives, Design and Digitale Cultuur, Design and Digital Culture. I would also like to mention again the book that's coming out, 40 years of V2, and I would like to point you to a little dossier on the V2 archive and thinking about archive that is on the website of V2. And that has a text by Katazina there and a text by Lena there, and one of my little texts, and that we hope to grow into more. I already connected to a couple of other things from the archive from 2003, the research into capturing unstable media that was done around that time. That's very interesting. A lot of other events that were then with some essays and articles that were written around that time. I see that Alexandra is indeed sharing the links to Stap voor Stap Emotie Network in Dutch at Imagine IC and online, and archiving the social at the 17th of February at the Nieuw Instituut. I can mention that we have the winter sessions at V2, which is a closed thing, but it's a residency, a production residency for a couple of young artists next week here. And we have a radio operator show again on the 10th of February with probably Stefan Hofland and Alex Valk and maybe me, which is local radio here on Rotterdam. And we intend to always do a little thing about something from the archive as well. And yes, that's coming to an end. So good night to you all, and thanks again.